Yeah. So yeah, I'm a volunteer from the Halton County Radio Railway, which is Ontario's electric railway museum out near Rockwood, Ontario. Uh, I'm their social media manager, and I've only been involved with them for a couple of years now. So today I'll be.
He muted himself. No, I did it.
Oh, there we go. Sorry, I'm not sure when I got cut off there.
It was my fault.
That's okay. All right, it's part of the
I was muting others.
So, yeah, I'm the social media manager for the museum. So I run their Facebooks and Instagram and Twitter pages. For those of you who use Facebook, I highly recommend you check us out. There's lots of pictures on there, including some of them that I'm going to be showing you today. The museum has done a lot of restoration work on old streetcars and other interurban or suburban equipment in the past 70 years of their history. As I mentioned, I'm a relatively new member, so I'm by no means an expert on old streetcar restoration. However, I've learned a lot in this brief amount of time that I've been involved with them. And I have begun work on restoring Hamilton's last streetcar, which I will be coming back towards at the end of the project. But of course, because you guys are the Richmond Hill Historical Society, you probably want to hear about the North Young car, number 416. So I'll be getting there, but I'm going to start with my slideshow for you guys. Can you guys see that? Okay, so today's presentation, Railcar Restoration, reviving old streetcars at the Halton County Radio Railway. Nope. So, long story short, the Halton County Radio Railway Museum was founded to save this streetcar, number 1326. This was the TTC's last wood streetcar. It was built in 1910 for the Toronto Railway Company. The TTC acquired it in 1921, and it was eventually retired in 1951. The founders of the museum really wanted to save this from the scrapyard, so they bought some property near Guelph Line, near Rockwood, and had it trucked there. Now, again, like long story short, the TTC asked that they had to buy a second car in order to get this first car, number 1326. And this is 1326 in storage at St. Clair Division Yard, which is also now known as Witchwood Barns. You can see it, it's the largest car under the tarp there. And this is the second car that the museum founders were sort of required to purchase in order to get that first car. This was a former Toronto Civic Railway streetcar. And in this picture here, it was being used as a scraper car by the TTC. This is 1326 being trucked toward, I think, arriving at the museum's property in 1954. Now, mind you, at the time, this is by no means a museum. This was just a piece of land that our founders bought to put this thing. Here are some of the museum founders restoring the original paint job onto the smaller Toronto Civic Railway car. So when they got it from the TTC, it was painted red, as I showed you in that earlier photograph. But here, it looks like they're putting on a layer of silver, and eventually the thing will be painted green, like this. So this was really like their first act of restoration, was converting this streetcar back to its Toronto Civic Railway look. This is the same spot from the other side where work had begun on restoring 1326. In this shot here, the museum's first barn is under construction. This would now be in the east end of our property. For those who have been to the museum will know this is barn number 1 with 1326 in the background there. This was the third car acquired by our museum founders, number 107 from the Montreal and Southern Counties Railway. And this is it arriving at Rockwood Station in 1956. This is later on in 1968 with the arrival of number 327. This was a replica built by the TTC and was donated to the museum in this year, 1968. This is the end of the line of the museum in 1969. It's grown quite a bit then, but it was interesting when I found this photograph to see how it just sort of ended there in the woods like that, before the loops were built at either end. This is London and Port Stanley Railway, an interurban number 8, built in 1915. This would have operated between London, Ontario and Port Stanley, passing through St. Thomas. And in this photograph here, it was at the TTC's property prior to being brought to the museum. So as you can see, it's being picked up by a flatbed truck. There's even some nice Brill trolley coaches next to number 8 in this photograph. And this is number 8 arriving at our museum. Here it is next to barn number 1, having just been unloaded by the truck. And as you can see, it's sitting on some stacks of wood. It didn't even have its own wheels underneath of it. This is barn number 2. This is our current restoration and maintenance barn. This is the building where most of the restoration work has been done in recent years. There are there's pits under in this building so that the volunteers can get underneath the cars to work on them. Now this is 416, the North Young car, as I'm sure you guys are familiar with it. It was used as a cottage in Hillsborough, Ontario for a number of years. So this is a picture of it still as a cottage. This is another angle of it here. Now for, long story short, the history of this car is that it was built in 1925 for the Toronto and York Radial Railways. In 1927, it was acquired by the TTC, who took over for the Toronto and York Radial Railways from their previous owners, which were the Hydroelectric Power Commission. Now in 1930, the North Young Railways opened from Glen Echo Loop up Yonge Street to Richmond Hill. Now, prior to this line opening, there had been the Metropolitan Railway that ran a streetcar line all the way up to Lake Simcoe. However, when the TTC basically relaunched this North Young line as the North Young Railways, they only wanted to go as far north as Richmond Hill. Here's a nice color picture of our very same suburban car, number 416, on Yonge Street in 1948. This is in Hoggs Hollow, and it's passing a windmill here, which I did a little bit of digging to find that you can see where this windmill used to be located. I've circled it here. This is an aerial shot from 1947 from the Toronto Archives. And we get close here, you can see where it was located off Yonge Street near Ivor Road. So this is just north of where Glen Echo Loop was. So this is the same spot today of where that windmill was and that 1940 photo was taken. And this is my comparison to show what's in the same spot there today. Now, what I find interesting, when I had posted this to Facebook, a few people had pointed out that where that windmill was, there's now a large condominium complex built there, and that somebody had said, oh, there are water fountains where that windmill used to be. However, after doing some research, I've seen where those water fountains are, and they're not exactly in the same spot as where the windmill was. So it's possible those fountains were built in honor of the windmill, but they were not the exact spot where that windmill was. And here I have blueprints for these North Young cars, numbers 409 to 416. These were double-ended cars, meaning there were controls and trolley poles and headlights at both ends so that the car could just stop and then head back in the opposite direction without a need of loops. And this is 416 at the museum in 1978. So after the museum had acquired 416, they had bought it from the son of the owner who was using it as a cottage. And so it was trucked to the museum, and over the years, restoration work had begun on turning this from a cottage back into a streetcar. And in 1978, I believe the celebration was Go Transit starting up a Young line. So the museum displayed number 416 at the Richmond Hill Plaza. And it was done in sort of a very last minute, like they just patched it together to make it presentable for this display. It was by no means even close to being fully restored when it was on display here. But I think the museum guys did a great job at doing the sort of last minute fix up for the car. Now, in 1980, the museum sent 416 to Toronto for a display at the CNE. As you can see in this photo, restoration had progressed a lot more on the car in only 2 years. It was already looking much, much better than it did in 1978. Now, I believe this is taken near the Dufferin Gates entrance to the CNE, if this spot looks familiar to some of you. And this is inside of number 416. You can see that the museum had some photograph displays about the history of public transit. And there was a volunteer from the museum there. I'm not sure her name, but she was probably answering questions about the museum and about the car. Now, this same year, this photograph may have actually been taken before that CNE display, but you can see this is on the inside of our restoration barn number 2, and on the right side there you can see 416 with a tarp over top of it, and in the center there is PCC 4000, one of those old Streamliner red rockets that the TTC used to operate, and on the left side is number 1326, as I mentioned, the TTC's last wood streetcar and the museum's first artifact. And then that same day, here's 1326 pulled out front of barn number 2. And here's the interior of 1326. As you can see, it truly was a wood streetcar inside and out. Another artifact in our collection was L2, an electric locomotive. It was a box cab style of locomotive built in 1915 for the London and Port Stanley Electric Railway. Seen here in 1983, it's the paint scheme it had on the time isn't what we have on it now. I believe this may have been a as retired scheme, and we have since restored it to its original 1915 paint scheme. This photo was taken in Wonderland Gardens in London, Ontario. And these two structures, well, these are former London Street Railway streetcars. And they were used as change rooms for the pools at this public park. And on, I believe that year, 1983, the museum went to acquire, I believe on the left it was number 25. But when the crane went to pick up number 25, the thing fell apart on them. So they put it down and they took number 23 instead, the car on the right. So here, this is LSR number 23, or London Street Railway, the streetcar. It was being used as the men's change room at the time. And here it is being picked up by crane and being placed on a flatbed truck to be brought to our museum. And here it is, the London car in barn number 2, still very much looking like a change room, but you can see that restoration work had begun already. This is another shot, a bit of a closer up of the car, and you can see just how much the wood had rotten under the front dash there from its years as being used as a change room. This is one of our Volunteers Doug McHewitt, painting one of our streetcars back in the 1980s. Doug is still an active member of the museum and does a lot of restoration work and other stuff on the property. Here we've got the first two streetcars in the museum's collection, 1326 and 55, out and about on a beautiful summer day in 1984. And you can see on the left side there is Rockwood Station. That was the train station in Rockwood, Ontario that was trucked to our museum in the 1970s. And here we've got number 416 again, the North Young car, out and about on our museum, looking pretty good, despite the car is still not fully restored even till this day, but they did manage to get it out and about in the 80s and 90s for a few test runs, including seen here. This is another one of our volunteers, Ian Smith, painting one of our streetcars in 1984. Ian Smith is also still very active at the museum. I should note that because of the pandemic, the museum has been closed for almost a year and a half now, and that they've been focusing on behind-the-scenes maintenance. So I haven't been up to the museum since 2020, but guys like Ian Smith here they play very important roles at the museum, so he's been going up to continue with maintenance work. Here we have number 8 again, the London and Port Stanley car. Now it's in 1984, and as you can see, it was operating at our museum. It had come a long way since we picked it up in 1971. Now it still had an older paint scheme on it, the paint scheme that it was retired in, or sort of made to look like the paint scheme it was retired in. This is on the inside of Rockwood Station in 1987 at our museum, which was also undergoing some restoration work at the time. There appears to be what looks like a pot-belly wood stove on the left side there. Here we have 416 again. See, over the decades, the car was worked on by different members, and then those members would leave the project or move on from the museum. And so it was put back into a storage at the museum quite a few times. So it was brought out from some exhibits, some work was done, and then it was put back in storage. Sometimes for years it would sit, waiting for work to resume. This is another very pretty shot of 1326 out and about at our museum. This shot was taken by Richard Glaze, a very well-known transit photographer, in case any of you guys have ever heard of this man, Richard Glaze. Here we have that Montreal and Southern Counties streetcar, or interurban, out at our museum in 1988. It too having gone under a lot of restoration work since the museum acquired it in 1956. I believe the shot was taken in the 1990s. Here we've got the North Young car out front of barn number 2, looking pretty great, I must say. For again, the car has still not been fully restored, but even in the 1990s, it looked great, and it was operating under its own power. You can't really, it's hard to tell in this photograph, but it's missing a set of doors on the far side. If you look closely, you can kind of see right through the car. It only had doors on this one side. Here's another shot of the North Young car operating in the museum's property. This is another volunteer of ours, Dave Barrett, who's been involved with us for many years. He's a retired TTC electrician, and he's also always up at the museum helping out with maintenance and restoration work. The man knows what he's doing, and here he is in front of our snow scraper, number S37. Oh, sorry, this is a snow plow, TP11. So it was undergoing restoration work at the time and has since been completed. This is a relatively recent artifact that our museum acquired. This is a Plymouth locomotive built in the 1950s. It was acquired about a decade ago or so, I believe, and trucked to our museum and has since been stored in barn number 2. Here's another look at it. I believe it was out in Quebec at the time near a mine before being brought to our museum. Here again, we've got 416. This is again much more recently. I believe this is 2006, when work was being done on the roof of the car. Some of the volunteers, including David Andrew, who's been doing a lot of work into this, had noticed that the roof had been rotten, and so a lot of work had to be done replacing all the wood. Here's a picture, a little bit of a blurry one, but one of our volunteers working on the roof of 416, and you can clearly see Richmond Hill in the route sign. This shot, it's a bit blurry, but this is the inside of 416 having the roof taken off. Yeah, well, it's being put back together. Here's a much better picture of the top of the car. You can see the new wood slats being put on there. And again, a good look at the Richmond Hill route sign. There's even a brass whistle on the front here next to the route sign. And these are a set of the doors from the North Young car, I believe having just been restored and being waiting to be putting back in the car. Here's 2 of our volunteers working on the front windows of number 416 in our restoration shops. Again, this is still back in 2006. Now, this photo was actually taken as recently as 2018, when the shop guys pulled the North Young car out of the barn as part of their restoration work. And so here's a good look at it. You can see that it's actually been disassembled a bit because it looked a lot more put together in the 1980s when it was out for that C&E display. A lot of the parts have been taken back off for further restoration work. It's not sitting on its original trucks here. For those that don't know, a truck is a set of 4 train wheels. So if you're talking about train trucks, so it has 2 trucks, but it's not sitting on its original ones. You kind of see in this photograph, they're much smaller than what you would expect to be underneath that car. And here's the interior again of the North Young car, number 416. Looking pretty good. I think there's still quite a bit of work that needs to be done on the car, specifically underneath. There's a lot of pipes and wires and work that needs to be done. But aesthetically, the car looks great. Here's another shot, 2018, one of our volunteers working on the brake beam from 416. This beam would pull levers that pull the brake shoes on the wheels. And this is a truck, this is one of 416 trucks, as I mentioned earlier. You can see they've got 4 sets of train wheels. That makes 1 truck. And that's what all streetcars would have underneath. They're not buses. They don't have rubber tires. They have these steel-wheeled trucks. This is another set of doors that was fabricated at our museum for 416. So some of our volunteers built these in our wood shops, and they were awaiting a paint job at the time, but I believe that these doors have been completed since. Here we've got a pair of rollers or guides for the folding doors of 416. These were also fabricated by volunteers in our shops. And this is that London car again, number 23. That was the men's change room at Wonderland Gardens for many, many years. So as I didn't mention, this one was built 1901. It's an open bench car. It's got a people catcher on the front there, that metal fence looking thing. Many old streetcars from the time had those called safety fenders or pedestrian guards, but they're not cow catchers. See, Old trains had cow catchers. Those are more wedge triangle shaped on the front of old steam locomotives. But old streetcars had people catchers because they were worried about different obstacles than big trains, which were out in the countryside. You even did have larger streetcars, the ones called interurbans, that would have cow catchers because they were leaving the city and out in the countryside. But little streetcars in the city had people catchers. This is one of the volunteers, Ollie Cooper. Her and her husband Ron did a vast amount of work restoring this car, LSR 23, from a change room back into a streetcar. And this is her sitting inside of it. This is another look at LSR 23. This is the closed side. So as you may have noticed in that earlier photo, it's an open bench car. So the one side is open for the fresh air to come through, but this other side, the left side of the car, does have walls and windows. And this is a rear view of London Street Railway number 23. I must say our museum volunteers did a fantastic job restoring this from a change room. It's amazing. You see pictures of it, rotten from the water, barely resembling a streetcar. And today, it looks amazing. Ron and Ollie Cooper did a great amount of work on this thing. And here's a picture of London Port Stanley number 8. As I pointed out in an earlier photo of this car, it had a different paint scheme for many years, but now, since it's been restored to its 1915 look, which I personally think looks much better than that greenish as retired scheme that it had earlier in the years. And this is the interior of London Port Stanley number 8 with its beautiful purple seats. And you can see there are stained glass windows running on both sides of the cars. These interurban cars also had little bathrooms, and the toilets just emptied out onto the tracks. So you weren't supposed to use them in the station. You had to wait till you were far clear of the city before using the toilet. And that brings us into the modern era of the Halton County Radio Railway. In 2019, we started receiving some of these new streetcars with quotations, the CLRVs, which stands for Canadian Light Rail Vehicle. These were the TTC streetcars from 1978 until 2019, when the last of them were retired and replaced by those new streetcars, the 100-foot-long wheelchair accessible ones. So now our museum has some relatively modern streetcars that are fully operational. This is my picture of one in front of Rockwood Station in 2019. I believe that was the same day it arrived, because our overhead wire system at the museum is fully compatible with the TTCs. As soon as we got the streetcar on the property, they put the pole up and drove the thing, no problem. Here's another picture of mine. This is back again in 2019. You can see on the right side that our museum also got an articulated light rail vehicle. This is a bendy version of Toronto's iconic CLRV streetcars. And in the middle is old number 327. It was actually my idea to put number 327 in the middle there. See, we only had the new cars out in the yard, and I thought, hold on, we need an old car in the middle there for a nice picture. So the museum guys pulled this out and put it there, and I probably took about 1,000 pictures that day of just the scene alone, from every possible angle. It was great. Here's another look. This is from inside the barn, looking out at our old number 327 next to a CLRV. And here's the bendy streetcar, or ALRV, at our museum in the winter of 2019 with some of our cars. As you can see in the background in yard number 3, you can see there's a Peter Witt streetcar, a CLRV, and our rail grinding PCC streetcar W30. And this was actually the last time our museum was open to the public, was our Christmas show in 2019. This was our first Christmas show to feature one of the relatively modern streetcars, a CLRV. And it was quite funny that some people were kind of surprised to come out to a museum and see streetcars that had just been out in Toronto now at a museum. In this shot here that I took, you can notice actually there's a lineup of 4 streetcars, and at the back there's an orange caboose. Well, what's funny about this photo is it kind of looks like the caboose is being pulled by these streetcars, but the caboose is actually pretty far off in the background, and it's just an optical illusion that makes it look like it's sitting on the same line as the streetcars, which I thought was kind of neat that it looks like that. Here's another artifact that we got very recently in 2019. This is a horse-drawn bus, also known as an omnibus. This would have been operated by the Toronto Street Railway in the 1800s, I believe, the 1860s to the 1880s. This one was built in New York City, and it was actually in storage at the Canada Science and Technology Museum in Ottawa for 50 years before they finally gave it to our museum. And now it's on display whenever the museum finally reopens after this pandemic is done. This is another picture. This is in our display barn number 4. That's our newest car barn that was opened in 2011, where we keep a lot of our oldest vehicles on display, as well as now our youngest artifact, the Bendy streetcar. And this is Hamilton's last streetcar, number 521. It was built in 1927 by National Steel Car in Hamilton and put into use by the Hamilton Street Railway before finally being retired in 1951 when the HSR gave up its street railway fleet in favor of electric trolley buses. The streetcar, number 521, was given to a farm in Beamsville, Ontario, where it was used as a chicken coop. For 20 years, they had chickens living in this streetcar before museum volunteers finally saved it in 1973, I believe, and brought it back to the museum. Here I've got the blueprints of Hamilton's last streetcar. Well, it was the 500 series of cars. These are all identical, all built by National Steel Car. And here's the interior of a Hamilton Street Railway streetcar, identical to the one we have at the museum. This shot was taken in 1950. I believe that's car number 510, and the one have is 521. And so, as I had mentioned to you guys, I began restoration on this car in 2019. I have no previous experience with streetcar restoration. However, I was very determined to learn how. And so the museum has allowed me to work on this car. And so, one step at a time, the master mechanic, Gordon McEwitt, was showing me how to fix certain parts. And we started off with the headlight. So here's a picture of the headlight as it was on the car for before restoration work began. And so you can see here's my hand. We took the ring off the front there and polished it. I got a round piece of glass for the headlights. And then we took the whole headlight out of the front of the streetcar and we sandblasted it, cleaned it up, and repainted it. You can see here's the headlight piece hanging. I just spray painted it dark green, just like the rest of the streetcar is painted. And here it is being rewired. So again, our master mechanic, Gordon McEwitt, helped me wire up this headlight. And we got it illuminated for the first time in 69 years after the streetcar had been retired. It spent 20 years as a chicken coop, 40 years at our museum waiting restoration, and finally in 2019 or even 2020 we got the headlight lit up. So it's only a small step, but it's in my mind a very satisfying step to complete. Now, pretty much, unfortunately, since then we entered a pandemic, and that drastically slowed restoration work. I have done a bit more work on fixing up the front windows of the streetcar. However, I have not been able to do much since the pandemic has begun. This here is a roll sign not for the exact same model of streetcar, but this is from a Hamilton Street Railway streetcar, one of the double-ended ones from the 400 series. And I'm not sure if you guys can read. Can you guys read the names on the sign? Yeah. Well, what I find very cool is close to the second bottom one, it says Incline Railway, because in case you didn't know, Hamilton had incline railways back in the day, railways that went up the side of the mountain. They were there from the 1890s till 1930s until they were shut. They were put out of business by the automobile and some of the new accesses put up the mountain. So, yeah, and the museum let me get this picture of the route sign. Oh, sorry. Here's a close-up of the incline railway, which I thought was very cool to see on the route sign. And this is original, by the way. This is like 100 years old. This roll sign. It's normally kept in the archives at the museum. These are the 3 upper window sashes from the Hamilton car. Me and my father actually restored these. He's a professional painter, so we brought these back to my house from the museum, and we restored the wood and gave him a nice green paint job. And as you can see, so it says Westdale in the window here. That's the route that the route sign that I want to have on the streetcar. Basically what I did is I took pictures of the real roll sign that I just showed you, and I printed off a close-up of the Westdale name, and I just printed that off and I just taped it to the back of the glass. So it's sort of a temporary, I just thought it looked nice just to have a route sign on the thing for the first time again in 69, 70 years since it's had this on it. Also last year, we did some major work at the museum, and the museum rented a huge crane that came out to pick up our caboose and put it on a regauged truck. See, our museum has TTC gauge streetcar tracks, not standard gauge. So this caboose had to be regauged using a crane. Here's a close-up picture of our flying caboose. Here's that Plymouth locomotive again. Some of our volunteers have been doing restoration work on it. They had just removed the engine, which I believe is called a prime mover. And there's that prime mover from the locomotive in one of our storage cars or box cars. You see, we picked it up with a forklift. We do a lot of work with forklifts at our museum. This equipment is far too heavy for us to carry around and break our backs with. So these forklifts are very handy. Also, this was the same day. This was a very busy day in 2020. That crane picked up this electric locomotive, number 335, from the Lake Erie and Northern Railway. And it was placed on regauged trucks so that it could be moved easily around the museum for restoration work. Here it is again, number 335. Apparently, our master mechanic, Gordon McHewitt, says that this is his retirement project. When he doesn't want to be master mechanic in the museum anymore, he just wants to work on this locomotive. He says he's a bigger fan of these heavy electric locomotives. He's not a big of a fan of the dinky little streetcars, as he says. He prefers the heavier equipment. And I don't blame him. This is very powerful equipment. Apparently, this locomotive alone, if it was fully restored and we had the proper power supply, could pull our entire fleet of antique streetcars at our museum. This one locomotive could pull, we've got about 30, 40 cars, and it could pull it. But I don't think I'll ever see that happen. But maybe, you never know. And that essentially brings us to the end of the presentation. If you guys have any questions or comments, I'd be more than happy to answer them. If there's anything I may have said that was incorrect and you guys know better, please feel free to tell me right now. So yeah, any questions?
I have a